For two of the most important commanders of the Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, the events of April 12, 1861 would change everything. Their lives before Fort Sumter would turn them into great generals. Their lives after will shape history itself.
The legend is that Grant was a drunken butcher.
Lee is indeed committing a treasonous act.
You could see the veins in his neck throbbing. You could see him punch his hand into his fist.
Grant never lost a battle. Lee did.
He was not a warrior in his soul.
Between 1862 and 1865, the most critical chapter of American history will be largely written by the actions of these two great generals and the millions of men who fought under them. Rarely does history find two commanders so different in personality, character, upbringing, and strategy as the ultimate commanders of the Northern and Southern armies.
Nobody in 1861 expected the American Civil War to escalate to the level that it did.
The actions of Lee and Grant will finally resolve whether this young nation continues as one country or two.
You could see Grant and Lee as representative of their respective worlds, their respective societies. Lee seems to stand for everything that is supposedly best about the South.
Most people concentrate on their differences. Grant was from a humble family. Lee was a member of the first family of Virginia.
Frankly, the Grant family's roots in this country went back absolutely as far as the Lees did. Grant was completely a gentleman, but he was not socially adept the way Lee was.
General Robert E. Lee had a much easier early life. He was in this house where we're sitting today as a youngster. I think he might be one of the most interesting, loved cruisers that the world has ever seen.
Who are the men behind the legendary names? How do Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant's lives and experiences on the battlefield compare? Who was the better general? One thing in common is that they both have difficult childhoods and difficult fathers. They are both smart and sensitive in their youth, and that they both grew up to become cold-blooded killers.
Robert E. Lee was the son of Harry Lighthorse Lee, the governor of Virginia, a great hero of the American Revolution. Went to West Point, he had that in common with Grant, but Grant came from almost nothing.
Lee, 16 years older than Grant, is born in 1806 into a genteel kind of poverty to Ann Carter and Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee. Two of his ancestors, Francis Lightfoot and Richard Henry Lee, were signers of the Declaration of Independence. Stratford, the ancestral home of the Lees, had been a wealthy tobacco plantation until Robert's father squandered the family fortune by speculating on land and other poor investments.
The Lee family had fallen on hard times. Lighthorse Harry, who was a great revolutionary hero, was also a great land speculator and not always so above board. And so abandoned the family when Robert was a small child, and the family was quite poor when he was growing up.
When Robert is 12, Lighthorse Harry dies of a fever returning from the West Indies, where he has been living as a fugitive. It is a devastating loss for Robert, who was devoted to his jovial, fascinating, brilliant father. Robert develops into a strong, athletic teenager with a penchant for mathematics and a reputation as a leader among his peers. When he turns 17, he needs to make a decision about what he will do in life. The Lee family still has influence, and with his wealthy relatives' assistance, Lee enters West Point in July 1825.
Lee arrived at West Point and the United States Military Academy eager to learn, eager to succeed. Really was perhaps the example of what a cadet should have been.
Lee finds West Point harsh, the accommodations Spartan, and the rules confining. But he thrives in this atmosphere, remaining at or near the top of his class during his entire 4 years, graduating as adjutant or head of the Corps of Cadets. The year is 1829, 32 years to the start of the Civil War. In 1830, Lee begins to court the wealthy Mary Ann Randolph Custis, who grew up at Arlington, the fabulous mansion overlooking the Potomac across from Washington, D.C.
Mary Custis was a lovely person, and she had lots of friends. She was very dynamic, and she was very well loved.
With the grudging consent of Mary's father, they are finally married on June 30th, 1831.
The myth was that Grant's first 39 years were spent doing nothing important, that he was a failure, and that he really didn't achieve anything.
Perhaps the most remarkable thing about Ulysses S. Grant was that he was so unremarkable. He is born to Jesse and Hannah Grant in the Ohio River town of Point Pleasant, about 30 miles from Cincinnati. The year is 1822.
Grant grew up hardscrabble in a very small Ohio town.
His mother was a very quiet woman, and Grant was quiet too. But Hannah was sensible, she was deeply religious, and she was basically a very good mother. His father was more bombastic.
His father is a tanner of animal hides.
One of these little details that I've always thought was funny is he could never eat rare meat. The sight of blood made him sick, so clearly he was not a warrior in his soul.
He is said to have been shy and indifferent to school, but is a born equestrian with an almost subliminal understanding of animals.
So before Ulysses knew anything about this, the father began exploring how his son could be nominated.
His father was a real American 19th century entrepreneur type, not always completely honorable, but successful. And that's how he managed to push his son into West Point against Ulysses' own wishes.
Grant enters West Point in 1839 at the age of 17, where he becomes an indifferent student, collecting over 250 demerits.
Demerits would be for a whole variety of things. Being late for the lineup in the morning, being late for meals, not showing proper deference. Grant was caught cooking in his room. That was a demerit too.
Grant had many more demerits than Lee. He was obviously never expelled from the academy or unaware of anything that was going to cause him to fail as a cadet.
He graduates from West Point in 1843 in the bottom half of his class. The Civil War is 18 years away. Like Lee, Grant also falls in love soon after graduation to Julia Dent, the sister of a West Point classmate. But their marriage too will have to be postponed. The nation is on the verge of war with Mexico, and Grant's regiment is ordered to the Mexican border. At the Battle of Monterey, Grant's regiment is caught up in savage house-to-house fighting and is running low on ammunition. Grant volunteers to ride to the rear and send a message forward. Few who were there would forget the sight of the young lieutenant clinging to the neck and side of his horse as he gallops through the gauntlet of Mexican fire down one street and up another.
They clung to the one side of the horse, and he switched over, so all they saw was a horse. They didn't see Grant.
It's almost a scene out of a Hollywood stunt movie, dodging bullets through an onslaught of attacks from Mexican soldiers, riding almost parallel to the ground at points.
In March of 1847, Robert E. Lee lands at Veracruz with General of the Army, Winfield Scott. Lee fights in every major battle on the march to capture Mexico City.
Lee, Grant, Sherman, Jackson, many of the leaders of the Civil War had proved themselves in the Mexican War.
Both Lee and Grant are among the first U.S. troops to enter Mexico City and meet briefly. When they again meet at Appomattox, nearly 20 years later, at the close of the Civil War, Grant remembers the occasion, but Lee cannot recall it. When the Mexican War ends in 1848, Grant returns to St. Louis and marries Julia Dent.
It's a great love affair. It lasts a long, long time. Grant is absolutely miserable when he's not with his wife. It's one of the reasons he occasionally would drink a little too much.
For the next 5 years, Grant struggles on a series of military